If you have a conventional engine within your motor car, whether that engine is at the front or the rear, it will look like a huge piece of metal called the cylinder block. If you could get inside, at the bottom of that big bit of metal, you'd find this. This is the guts of the internal combustion engine of conventional type. It's called a crankshaft, and it rotates. Connected to it are the pistons, and it's this funny shape so that the piston, which is now at the bottom, will rotate and reach the top of its stroke before descending once again down to the bottom. If you could look at a crankshaft and a cylinder end on, it would look very much like this model we've got here. Simply, this is what happens. Here's the crankshaft. Connected to that is something here called the conrod, short for connecting rod, not surprisingly, and connected to the connecting rod is the piston, which is a tight fit within the cylinder, which is this area here. Simply what happens is that this valve, called the inlet valve, allows a mixture of air and petrol into the cylinder, which is compressed by the piston coming up, ignited by the spark plug, which expands that mixture, forcing the piston down again and turning the crankshaft here, which in turn starts off the powertrain that turns the driven wheels. As the piston here rises again, it forces the gases out, the burnt gases, through this exhaust valve. Now, most conventional motor car engines in use throughout the world run on the 4-stroke cycle. There are 2-stroke engines, but far and away the majority of conventional cars use the 4-stroke cycle. This is how the 4-stroke cycle works. This device here, called the camshaft, allows this valve to open as the piston descends. This allows the mixture of air and petrol from the carburetor to enter the cylinder there, and that's called the induction stroke. That's the first stroke. The piston then starts to rise again. This valve closes, compresses the mixture right up tight there. That is the compression stroke, and at this point the sparking plug will ignite that mixture. It expands, forcing the piston down like so. That's the power stroke. And finally, the last stroke, the piston rises, the exhaust valve opens, and the burnt gases are forced out here at the side. Very briefly once again then, down, induction, compression, gases are ignited, power stroke, and finally exhaust. You can see that the piston has gone up twice and gone down twice, 4 strokes. What we've been looking at is a cutaway model of what's called a side valve engine. It's so called because the valves live here and here in the cylinder block itself at the side of the cylinder. A very reliable engine, very easy to maintain. Millions and millions of side valve engines were made, and there are still hundreds and hundreds of thousands of them in use throughout the world. But they're not very efficient. They're not very efficient because in order to allow room for the gases to come in and go out, you have to have this area here. And because no one has yet succeeded in devising a T-shaped piston that will compress that area as well, all that is wasted space. It makes for low compression and indeed low revs. Wouldn't it be a good idea, said someone, if we could move the valves from here at the side of the cylinder block into here, into the cylinder head itself? It was a good idea, so they did it. This is the overhead valve engine with the valves now up here in the cylinder head, taking up much less room than the old side valve type and producing a much more efficient engine. In fact, the overhead valve engine is probably the standard motor car engine now generally in use throughout the world. Only one thing wrong with the concept, and that's how to connect the valves here with the camshaft, which is still right down there on the other side of the engine. The camshaft, remember, that is that piece of metal that turns and actually activates the opening and the closing of the valves. They've done it here with a rather complicated system of long rods called push rods, which in turn activate these levers called rockers, which in turn open and close the valves. So, although the overhead valve engine is inherently more efficient, there is friction and wear in this valve opening and closing system. Why not then bring the camshaft up the top as well, bringing it much nearer to the valves that it's going to open and close? Why not indeed? The overhead camshaft engine does just that, with the camshaft sitting over the valves, actually pushing them itself. The camshaft is connected to the crankshaft with a longer timing chain, as here. But the first real departure from convention came from Germany about 20 years ago when Felix Wankel came up with the rotary engine. Now, in the rotary engine, the place of the pistons has been taken by one or more rotors. This engine is from an Audi NSU R080, and despite its unconventional appearance, it still uses the 4-stroke cycle. Let's take a close look at the rotor assembly itself, and the first thing to notice is that it doesn't possess valves as such. It possesses holes, ports, for the gases to come in and go out. This is the equivalent of the inlet valve, simply a hole in the side. At the moment, therefore, the rotor is on the induction stroke. Watch. It moves round, the mixture is being sucked in, and now the rotor is covering over that hole. It's covered it over, so we're now on the compression stroke as the mixture is compressed tighter and tighter until it reaches the top, whereupon the plug will fire here, igniting the mixture and moving the rotor on into a power stroke, going down here, until the rotor then exposes the exhaust port here, forcing the gases, allowing the gases to move out of the rotor assembly, and that's the exhaust stroke. The great beauty of the rotary engine, only 7 moving parts, but at the moment still a reasonable rarity. They're only used in the Audi NSU R080, certain Mazdas from Japan, and the new rotary GS from Citroën. And what the future holds for rotary engines still remains to be seen. But for we ordinary mortals with conventional engines in our motor cars, there's really one major tip to remember, and it's this one. If you drive your engine within its limits and you do not over-rev it, especially in low gears, your engine will certainly last you a lot longer.